Hello and welcome to this first video in a series of 10, produced as outputs for the Reveal project. My name is Dr. David McMenemy and I am based in the Information Studies subject at the University of Glasgow. And this first video is focused on what is advocacy, and will include some discussion around techniques of rhetoric and argument that can be utilised in advocacy work. The Reveal project was funded by the CILIPS Research Fund, with the aim to enhance collective advocacy across the profession through an accessible framework for library and information ethics and values, presented as a set of continuing professional development tools. And these videos are part of that output. But you will also find infographics as well as PowerPoint slides and an extensive literature review on the topics that will be discussed in the videos. This is the first video in a series of 10, and the remaining videos will cover a range of subjects, including ethical theories, as well as CILIPS ethical framework, freedom of expression in libraries, privacy in libraries, ethics of information organisation, intellectual property, some contemporary concerns in terms of ethics in libraries, some experiences of the Scottish Library workforce, and the final video will focus on how to do values-driven advocacy. But this first video, as I said, is focused on advocacy. Now, the Cambridge English Dictionary defines advocacy as public support of an idea, plan, or way of doing something. The term is generally understood as applying to a course of action or a set of strategies that promotes engaging an audience or audiences to persuade them of the merits of a specific argument or cause. Now, the next question is, who does advocacy? Well, advocacy happens at a range of different levels, from the kinds of advocacy done at a global level by international bodies, to national advocacy undertaken by national representative bodies, to the more local advocacy seen in towns and communities across the world. So, for example, CILIPS advocate for libraries in Scotland, while IFLA does so globally. But it's really important to remember that advocacy is also done every day by professionals who serve the needs of clients and users, and for whom the quality of service and the outcomes received by the client prove crucial in furthering the wider societal goals of the professions concerned. So, every library worker should be concerned with advocacy and should be understanding the importance of their own practice in delivering advocacy daily. In a 2018 study of 50 policy areas across Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden and the UK, it was found that the extent to which an advocate's chances of preference attainment increases with public support depends on the number of advocates lobbying on an issue. So the research has essentially proven that the more advocates you have on a specific cause or topic, the better for the long-term viability of that cause or topic. And more specifically, when we talk about libraries, well, Hoover defines advocacy as the process of educating and influencing decision makers to enlist their active support for libraries of all types. Hummel suggests library advocacy is about engaging fully in the political process. Hicks observes that advocacy is often considered part of a continuum with marketing and public relations. Public relations communicates this is who we are, this is what we do, for whom and when. Marketing asks, who are you? What do you want? How can I best deliver it to you? Tell you about it? And what price are you willing to pay? Whereas advocacy says to decision makers, potential partners, funders, any stakeholder, your agenda will be greatly assisted by what we have to offer. So why do values matter in advocacy then? Well, in the case of CILIP, the ethical framework that we all follow and that all members adhere to, forms a bond between the professional and the professional body to uphold, promote, and advocate for these values. Garrow and Hasenfeld's research highlights that an organisation's moral frame explains the type of advocacy it is likely to pursue. And the moral frame of an organisation is normally conceptualised within a mission statement, or as above for professional bodies, additionally in the ethical frameworks that members have to uphold. Now, We'll talk more later in this video about understanding differing viewpoints, but it's really important to get this notion on the books straight away. Feinberg and Weiler have investigated the importance of understanding opponents' political or ethical viewpoints, and their findings suggest that advocating for an issue or cause needs to understand the political viewpoint of those who you're trying to convince of your cause, which might mean reframing your arguments to fit the moral standpoint of those very people that you're trying to persuade. Now, the researchers acknowledge that this is very challenging for many of us, because doing so may ultimately compromise our own beliefs. So that means advocacy is often not straightforward. If you're preaching to your own audience, again we'll talk about that a little bit later, that can be easier. But if you're trying to engage people who may not necessarily understand what you do, or who even agree with aspects of what you do, then that can become immensely challenging. Now, if we arrive at the conclusion that advocacy is about persuading others of the merits of your argument or cause, then the concept of persuasion and how it's actually undertaken becomes vital to understand. And this places us in a theoretical area known as rhetoric, defined by the Cambridge Dictionary as speech or writing intended to be effective and influence people. So I'm going to spend a lot of this video talking about the techniques of rhetoric, and it's based on the work of Ramage, Bean and Johnson, the 2007 edition of their book, Writing Arguments, a Rhetoric with Readings. Now, this book is in many editions, and I highly recommend it to you if you're interested in reading much more on this topic, and really any edition you can manage to pick up should be useful in regards to this topic. Now, we begin with the context of an argument. The social context of an argument, and in this context we're defining argument as engagement with a concept or idea between one or more parties. Now, this can be visualised as a triangle with interrelated points labelled message, writer and speaker, and audience. And this is what Ramage, Bean and Johnson call the rhetorical triangle. And they say that when you alter one point of the triangle, for example, when you change the audience for whom you're writing, you often need to alter the other points by restructuring the message itself, and perhaps by changing the tone or image you project as writer or speaker. Now, how we think about the art of persuasion has been heavily influenced by the writing of Aristotle, who proposed a framework in his The Art of Rhetoric. Aristotle discussed the three key elements of persuasion, which are ethos, pathos, and logos. And a fourth element related to the context can also be added, Kairos, which relates to essentially context, opportunity, or moment. Now, logos relates to the strength of your case. This is the aspect of the rhetorical triangle that does not relate to the person speaking or the emotional impact of the message, but instead the logical consistency of the message itself. In public advocacy, this usually entails building your message on some kind of evidence that is convincing. These kind of arguments are usually called deductive arguments because they use provable and trackable facts to reach a conclusion. However, inductive arguments can also be made in rhetorical exercises by suggesting probable outcomes that may occur if certain scenarios are played out. Now, the key thing in both of these definitions, both deductive and inductive, is that the evidence that you utilise is strong and logical and convincing. So in a deductive argument, you might be using lots of statistics. So these need to be accurate, and they need to be obviously understandable and really put over a convincing case to the person you're trying to convince. And inductive arguments, if you're trying to posit a scenario or an outcome that you think might occur if investment in libraries, for instance, is basically increased or targeted, then these arguments also have to be logical. So the outcome has to be something tangible that the audience you're trying to advocate to can understand. Ethos is otherwise known as the appeal to credibility. And ethos is utilised in relation to the character of the speaker delivering the message. So, for instance, are they trustworthy? Do they speak from a position of knowledge and or authority? And as a messenger, would they be liable to respect from the audience and thus believed by the audience? Ethos is also relevant in terms of the delivery of the message by the speaker. For instance, do they show balance in presenting a case before they state their preferred view? Ramage, Bean and Johnson highlight that Aristotle believed that trust in a speaker actually resides within the speech itself, not in the prior reputation of the speaker. So how do we create ethos then? Firstly, be knowledgeable about your issue. Know your topic area. Be accurate on issues like statistics and concepts. If your evidence is sound, then your argument will be. Be fair. As well as knowing your own side, know and acknowledge other sides with respect. Ramage, Bean and Johnson argue that there are very few situations where scorn is merited, and usually only when you're talking to your own community. Thus, showing empathy to alternative views is generally the best strategy. And lastly, build a bridge to your audience. Attempting to find common ground between the values of your community and/or cause and the values of those you're trying to influence. And this strengthens the ethos of the speaker because it shows respect for the views of your audience or opposition, and thus shows you as a reasonable person. Pathos is essentially empathy for an argument. So in rhetoric, pathos relates to the values and beliefs of the audience and how this is tapped into by the speaker and the message. A large aspect of this is the notion of empathy, utilising skills to present a message that the receiver not only understands, but is actually sympathetic to on a human level. Ramage, Bean and Johnson state that pathos helps us see what is deeply at stake in an issue, what matters to the whole person. Now, it's also important to recognise that pathos can be used to manipulate people with the use of false or misleading information, and therefore it must be used in an ethical way. So how do we achieve pathos? Firstly, use concrete language. Concrete language focuses on tangible concepts that an audience can understand, rather than abstract concepts that might confuse. Grounding your arguments in positive language that appeals to our senses, that allows us to imagine ourselves in that situation. Secondly, use specific examples and illustrations. Building on the use of concrete language, the use of specific examples can be immensely useful in building pathos. Examples from the lives of real people, for instance. If your service is engaged in public service, now that's a significant way to allow audiences to understand what your service provides and what they can benefit from and other people in their community can benefit from. Use narratives. Telling important stories that appeal to your audience's values can also help build pathos, especially opening narratives that set a scene. However, if done incorrectly, they can also be a risk. Quoting here from Ramage, Bean and Johnson, if they are too private, too self-indulgent, too sentimental, or even too dramatic and forceful, they can backfire on you. Next, choose words, metaphors, and analogies with appropriate connotations. Selecting words, metaphors, or analogies that match your aim can also be a very good way of building pathos. Ramage, Bean and Johnson use the example of a new policy initiative, which, if you're supporting, you could call bold and decisive, but if critiquing, can call haughty and autocratic. The framing of the argument you make must be with a view to guiding the audience to see the argument through your angle of vision. Now, what does all this mean in real life? Well, Jenna Wright summarises as follows. An advocate representing children's issues could provide statistics that demonstrate the scale and consequences of a problem, which would be logos. Share stories about children who are personally affected by the problem, that would be pathos. And demonstrate why the advocate is to be trusted on the issue due to credentials or experience, and that would be the ethos. And Jenna Wright's argument is actually a good one for us. You could see that easily applying to situations related to library services, whether involving children's services or not. The idea being demonstrate the problem via logos, sharing stories about people affected by it, pathos, and demonstrate why your organisation or you are the right people to be talking about this issue, and that's ethos. Now, Kairos relates to context and timing. And Ramage, Bean and Johnson say that thinking kairotically is to be attuned to the total context of a situation in order to act in the right way at the right time. So, for instance, if a topic or theme is in the news or currently being debated in the public consciousness, and it's something that impacts on your cause, then you could try to engage with that debate. For example, at the moment the media is focused on issues around book censorship and so-called cancel culture, and this is an important opportunity for those who are in professions who are well versed in the debates related to intellectual freedom versus offensive content to have their say. So we have a role to play in that debate in terms of shaping it. Also, being aware of the likely timelines of legislation and policy development within your field is also a vital element of Kairos. If you're aware that a policy is in the planning phase that will have an impact on your cause, you can develop a strategy for engaging with that policy issue before and during this policy development phase. And this brings us to discuss engaging with different types of audiences. The kinds of arguments that could be made in terms of a cause roughly divide into three categories: one-sided, multi-sided, and dialogic. One-sided arguments present only the case of the speaker, while multi-sided arguments present the case of the speaker, but also engage with alternative or conflicting views. Dialogic arguments are characterised as more complex, where the writer presents himself as uncertain or searching, where the audience is considered a partner in a dialogue, and where the writer's purpose is to seek common ground, perhaps leading to a consensual solution to a problem. Ramage, Bean and Johnson suggest a tool called the scale of resistance, which you could draw up in advance of making a case for any advocacy you're doing. And what this allows you to do, essentially, is to reflect on all the opinions that might be expressed around your topic. And the reason being, quote here from Ramage, Bean and Johnson, "Seldom will you encounter an issue in which the range of disagreement follows a simple line from accord to resistance. Often, resistant views fall into different categories so that no single line of argument appeals to all those whose views are different from your own. You have to identify not only your audience's resistance to your ideas, but also the causes of that resistance." And what the tool looks like? Well, it's rather straightforward. Essentially, it's a table that basically runs on a scale from accord on one side to resistance on the other, with undecided or neutral in the middle. And on the accord side, you have strongly supportive, supportive with the conditions. Undecided neutral, you have uncertain. Moving to resistance, we have mostly opposed or strongly opposed. And what you do for the topic is under each of those columns, you would list the reasons that people might object based on that stance. And this can be immensely useful because you can use this tool as a way of understanding potential arguments that may be posited against your cause. So try it out with any topic you feel that you wish to advocate for and see how useful it is in terms of building your own case in a stronger way. Now, a short aside on library censorship, because we are going to talk about the specific library topics later on. But James LaRue cites an arguably similar sentiment when reflecting on how censorship might actually manifest in libraries from the point of view of parents who might seek to limit access to some titles in schools or public libraries through censorship challenges. And a quote here from James's article. He says, "In short, censorship had an emotional context. The issue wasn't really about the culture wars or extreme political agendas. It was about the difficulty many of us have when our children cross the threshold from infancy to childhood, or childhood to adolescence and maturity. In an attempt to cope, parents went through paroxysms of anger, grief, self-righteousness, and a grasping for control. The library was an incidental target, part of the larger problem of a world where their kids were growing up faster than their parents were ready for." LaRue continues that once this empathic realisation is made, dialogue can actually occur. However delicate, and involved a balance between respect, listening to the concern and giving it authentic consideration, and institutional purpose. LaRue concludes in this area that often it entails a librarian or institution stating to the complainer that "we seek to serve you well, but you're not the only one we serve." This moves us on to talk about the different types of argument. So one-sided arguments. These are extremely common in terms of advocacy because, notwithstanding that they may be seen as a form of preaching to the choir, they can be hugely effective in keeping people who believe in your cause motivated and ready for action. Appealing to an undecided or neutral audience is a little more complex, as in-group appeals that motivate an already supportive audience can repel a neutral or undecided audience. Now, this type of audience could be considered as akin to jurors, contemplating all sides of an argument before deciding, but being highly resistant to any arguments that seek to demonise or caricature alternative viewpoints. So engaging with undecided or neutral audiences. This is usually built around what is often referred to as the classical argument, another concept we can trace back to the time of Aristotle, and something that is a core skill in rhetoric. And there are 5 elements to this. Firstly, introducing your issue, problem or cause. Second, presenting your case. Third, addressing the opposition to your issue, problem or cause. Fourth, providing your proof to support your argument. And fifth, presenting your conclusion. Now, what techniques can we use to engage undecided or neutral audiences? So on the left-hand side of the table, we have strategies, and on the right-hand side, we have potential activities. Firstly, summarising opposing views. Follow the principle of charity here, which obliges you to avoid loaded, biased or strawman summaries that oversimplify or distort opposing arguments, making them easier to knock over. In terms of refuting opposing views, you attempt to convince readers that the opposing view is logically flawed, inadequately supported, or based on erroneous assumptions. You can rebut, firstly, the writer's stated reasoning grounds. Secondly, the writer's warrant and backing, which means underlying assumptions, or both. In terms of rebutting evidence, and not all of these will apply in all cases, you would obviously select the appropriate one for your case. But firstly, you can deny the truth of the data. You can cite counterexamples and counter-testimony. Cast doubt on the representativeness or sufficiency of the examples. Cast doubt on the relevance or recency of the examples, statistics, or testimony. Call into question the credibility of an authority. Question the accuracy or context of quotations. And question the way the statistical data were produced or interpreted. And lastly, conceding to opposing views. You must sometimes concede to an opposing argument rather than refute it. And this often entails switching to an alternative field of values, that as opposed to the one that you're refuting to argue your case. In terms of resistant audiences, Ramage, Bean and Johnson suggest that often when an audience holds an alternative view to that of the writer or advocate, the classical argument can be interpreted as being too critical to the worldview of that audience and can solidify resistance. Some debates are just too polarised, and the bridge between the poles cannot really be fully constructed, no matter how good the argument. And in these cases, the goal may be simply to open dialogue by seeking common ground. That is, by finding places where the writer and audience may actually agree. One way of doing this is using the delayed thesis argument. And the delayed thesis argument delays the thesis you wish to present until the end of your argument. For resistant audiences, it may be better to keep the issue open, delaying the revelation of your own position until the end. Delaying the thesis in your argument can allow you to deeply engage your audience with the issues at play, presenting a range of viewpoints before actually stating the one that is your thesis. Another technique is the Rogerian argument, and this is named after the psychologist who developed the strategy, Carl Rogers. And this strategy entails what Rogers called empathic listening, which is based around the notion of engaging with another's perspective on an issue sympathetically. In utilising this strategy, the writer reduces a sense of threat in her argument by showing that both writer and resistant audience share some basic values. And how do you do this? Well, firstly, do not attack the resistant audience's stance as wrong-headed. Instead, respect their position and show an understanding of it. And 2, do not ask the resistant audience to capitulate fully to your point of view, but instead encourage just a shift towards your point of view. This in itself shows that your own position is not a hardened one. And as Ramage, Bean and Johnson state, by acknowledging that you has already shifted towards the audience's views, the writer makes it easier for the audience to accept compromise. Now, in talking about all of this, it's also important to note that not all arguments can be made sufficiently enough to convince people. Not every dispute over answers is a rational argument, as Ramage, Bean and Johnson say. It can be immensely difficult to determine in some cases whether others in opposition to your position are acting in good faith, especially in an area of culture wars. However, we can start by recognising that rational debate about an issue requires two factors. Firstly, reasonable participants who operate within the conventions of reasonable behaviour. And secondly, potentially shareable assumptions that can serve as a starting place or foundation for the argument. And Ramage, Bean and Johnson say that lacking one or both of these conditions, disagreements remain stalled at the level of pseudo-arguments. They also highlight the role of fanatical believers and fanatical skeptics. A reasonable argument assumes the possibility of growth and change. Disputants may modify their views as they acknowledge strengths in an alternative view or weaknesses in their own. Such growth becomes impossible, and arguments degenerate to pseudo-argument when disputants are fanatically committed to their positions. Fanatical believers simply believe that their claims are true and will hear nothing that contradicts this in good faith. There is a party line that they follow, whether political or cultural, and, as Ramage, Bean and Johnson say, their ideological convictions are often shaped by their favourite, not-to-be-disputed texts. On the other hand, a fanatical skeptic accepts nothing and dismisses the possibility of proving anything. So, genuine arguments. Genuine engagement with ideas is impossible in engagement with both fanatical believers or fanatical skeptics. And Ramage, Bean and Johnson also highlight another important source of pseudo-arguments as a lack of shared assumption between parties. Engagement with an argument on behalf of the parties involved starts with the premise of shared assumptions, and without these in relation to the parties involved in the argument, there is no bottom to the argument, just an endless regress of reasons based on more reasons. So this video was focused on defining advocacy and also some of the techniques from rhetoric that can be utilised in advocacy. We considered topics such as ethos, logos and pathos, as well as Kairos. We also considered the differences between one-sided, multi-sided and dialogic arguments, and also some of the ways these arguments can be made and engaged with. The next video will focus on ethical theories, as well as some of the key ethical thinkers in libraries. I hope you found the content of this video useful, and I hope to see you in the next videos.